In 1996, Nintendo released its third generation of home consoles with the Nintendo 64. 2 years later, they took on the challenge to move Zelda into 3D, and in turn, they created the most highly rated video game to this day with the Ocarina of Time. Using the bizarre Trident controller of the N64, Nintendo showed what AAA gaming could be in this new generation, and inspired hundreds of future games. 2 years later, Nintendo had the impossible task of following that up. The solution was to create one of the weirdest games you can play today, and make everyone ask the question, what if the moon had a face and started falling towards us and would kill us all in 3 days? Zelda Majora's Mask helped answer that question, and has become one of the most iconic games in the whole franchise due to its uniquely daunting tone and story. I enter into the third dimension on my journey to the Tears of the Kingdom with the Nintendo 64 titles of The Legend of Zelda. Arguably the most iconic in the whole franchise, and certainly one of the most iconic games in history, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is considered by many to be a masterpiece. Just like A Link to the Past, its evolution of the franchise feels astronomical, not only to the series, but to video games in general. Releasing on 21st of November 1998, this true classic of a game completely blew people away. Review scores were the highest of any game ever, with pretty much every media outlet giving it 10 out of 10. And, to this day, is still the only game on Metacritic to hold a 99 review score. It was an industry-defining game, and truly showed the future of 3D adventure games and beyond. It introduced Z-targeting, a lock-on system to fight enemies or focus on objects in 3D, which is a mechanic used in almost every third-person 3D game since. For me, I had already seen this feature and work in a few games before I played Ocarina of Time, as I first played it in 2006. Shortly after completing The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, my first in the franchise, I carried on to the included bonus disc that had the original game and its Master Quest variant. I played it most days for several weeks. With a lot of Zelda tricks and puzzles still being new to me, it took a while to work my way through it. However, to this day it's still one of the most enjoyable games I've ever played. It gave a huge sense of adventure and still does now, and while not being as broad a map size as Wind Waker with its Great Sea, the Land of Hyrule still felt vast and mysterious to me. Even 8 years after its release, I could still see why everyone loved this game, and how it went on to influence so many others. Gameplay-wise, it felt very familiar to me due to playing Wind Waker first, but very different with the art style and tone of the story and world. While Wind Waker shines with its bright, cartoony and colourful world, and of course its large map to explore, Ocarina of Time has a much darker style with more of a focus on filling as much into each area as possible, and a bigger focus on puzzles rather than exploration. This works better for its map size. With it being the first 3D Zelda, the world was always going to be smaller than the rest of them. But by filling each area with so much to discover and interact with, it makes the world feel dense with content. Sadly, this doesn't extend to the central hub of the world, Hyrule Field, which is practically void of any meaningful encounters or secrets to find, and more just feels like a playground to run around on horseback in. This is something that a lot of open worlds do get wrong even today though, so considering this is one of the first, I would say it's pretty excusable. Where this game truly shines for me though, is pretty much everywhere else. The game still has fantastic dungeon design, with great themes throughout them, each tied to the sage that represents them. And the option to tackle them in almost any order makes each playthrough feel a little bit different. Unlike in Link to the Past where the dungeons were fairly interchangeable as to what environment they suited, Ocarina of Time made each one feel like a part of the world, with the Fire Temple inside Death Mountain and Spirit Temple in a graveyard being two of my favourites. Even the mini-dungeons have a lot of character to them, with the bottom of the well in Kakariko Village being a particularly creepy and unnerving place to go through. The dungeon design still holds up great, and in my opinion, even the infamous Water Temple does. I found I got stuck on this playthrough because I missed one key that held me back, so it still took me longer to complete than any other dungeon, and due to the verticality of it, makes finding each room quite tough. Once you know the correct order in which to complete the dungeon though, it becomes fun to work through, and has a great mini-boss with the return of Shadow Link. What does make it frustrating though is having to constantly change into your iron boots to sink in the water. A lasting issue across the series up to this point was how you would equip items, with previous games only having 1 or 2 slots, with your sword and shield occupying them as well. With Ocarina of Time, Nintendo utilised the controller to the fullest, with 3 item buttons and separate buttons for your sword and shield. This was great, but what begs the question is why on earth did they make the Iron Boots and Pegasus Boots a piece of equipment rather than a quick use item? This means bringing up your inventory over and over again to switch them. I played on the Switch Online version for this playthrough, so it was fairly quick to do, but it was still annoying. The original game runs at about 25 frames a second and would lag when opening the menu, making changing equipment extremely tedious to get through. Thankfully, Ocarina of Time 3D does fix this, but it shouldn't have been an issue in the first place. Another area that's come under a lot of criticism over later years is the combat, with big YouTubers voicing loudly that all it entails is waiting and blocking. While they have valid points, this doesn't make the combat bad or boring. You can utilize the items in your arsenal to give yourself openings to fight enemies quicker, exploit weaknesses in their fighting styles and armor, and you can make new openings by using Deku Seeds, the hookshot, bombs, arrows, and more to defeat enemies faster than simply sticking to the default of Z targeting and attacking with your sword. The combat allows for a little bit of creativity to take down your foes, with only the boss fights being more rigid in how you have to defeat them. Although they are more specific, the boss fights are still enjoyable, with highlights for me being the final Ganon fight and the Twin Rover fire and ice battle. But there are a few annoying fights, especially the Water Temple boss fight. There's so many different boss and enemy designs though, that you have a lot of variety to prevent the combat from ever getting boring. It may not be as good as it is in later games in the series, but it's still a lot of fun and clearly inspired a lot of games after it. Probably my favourite aspect of the game is its story and characters. This is a huge step up from A Link to the Past, where there was only a few identifiable characters. Ocarina of Time, practically every NPC is recognisable and quirky, from creepy potion shop makers and cackling witches, goofy Gorons, elegant Zoras, except maybe the king, the deadly Gerudo, the childish Kokiri, and many more characters, including some cameos from Mario and Luigi themselves. This game really has so much charm and life to its design, with one of my favourite characters being the frantic frustration of the man in the windmill who was driven insane by your time-travelling paradoxical actions. Then of course, we have the iconic Sheik. Zelda's ninja-esque transformation has always been a fan favourite. And of course, Ganondorf, who for the first time appears in his human form and has a truly intense and intimidating design. The story itself is definitely the franchise's strongest up to this point. Link as a child is adopted by the Great Deku Tree and the Kokiri after his mother is fatally injured and flees from a great war. Link must venture into the world to meet many characters, find the spiritual stones to the Gorons, Zoras, and Kokiri, and meet Princess Zelda. When he opens the Temple of Time to receive the Master Sword, he unwillingly gives Ganondorf exactly what he wants, the Triforce, which allows him to overthrow the world for 7 years. Link is frozen in time while he becomes an adult in order to defeat Ganondorf, and after rescuing the sages, it all ends with Link, Zelda, and the sages trapping Ganondorf into the Sacred Realm. And then Link returns to his childhood, going on to create multiple timelines that have become the branching point of the entire series. It is still one of the best stories in the franchise, and for 1998 was unlike anything that had been done before. Finally, we have the presentation. Nowadays, the graphics are undeniably dated, with blocky characters, low-resolution textures and details. However, it's 25 years old. In 1998, these graphics were unbelievable, and unlike anything ever seen on a console and even most PC games. It still holds up today and has a lot of charm to it, and although it looks much better on the wonderful 3DS remake, they still hold up enough to not detract from the game. Music-wise, well, it once again contains some of the most iconic themes in gaming. Koji Kondo creates yet another masterful soundtrack, with catchy and iconic tunes such as Hyrule Field, Saria's Song, Zelda's Lullaby, Goron City, and many more. For a console that had no dedicated sound chip, it's absolutely incredible that all of these iconic themes were created with code and squeezed onto a game cart, notorious for having a worse sound quality and less storage space than a CD. Top this amazing music off with unique sound effects and even a fully playable ocarina that was another iconic staple to the gameplay and story. Overall, Ocarina of Time deserves all the praise it got back in 1998, and the praise it gets today. Sure, it has flaws, as does any game, and as with any franchise that made a first step into 3D, it has issues that would later be ironed out, such as an over-reliance on Navi the Fairy to guide you in the right direction. But despite the small issues this game has, many of which are blown out of proportion online, it's still incredible. An iconic piece of gaming history that everyone should play at least once. And despite not being my favourite in the franchise, it's still one of the most memorable and enjoyable experiences I've ever played. So, where did Nintendo take the franchise next? 2 years later, on the 27th of April 2000, Nintendo released one of the weirdest and most unique games out there, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. This game is unlike any other I have ever played, even in terms of Zelda games. With less than 2 years of development time, the team had to figure out how to make a completely new game. By using Ocarina of Time's game engine and assets, Nintendo managed to pull it off. As a direct sequel, it plays mostly the same, but it's expanded on due to the addition of the new mechanic of masks. There are a total of 24 of them, with some having little to no effect on how you control, but with 3 core ones that change the gameplay and provide Link with unique abilities for a multitude of situations. Swimming as a Zora, extra strength and an awesome rolling mechanic as the Goron, and the Deku allows you to temporarily fly, and gives you magical bubble powers. These 3 additional forms change up the gameplay from Ocarina of Time and are used heavily throughout the whole game. This was a great design decision, as in terms of the items you get, there are less than Ocarina of Time, and they are all the same item as well, with only 3 new items in the Powder Keg Bomb, the Great Fairy Sword, and the Picto Box, 2 of which have very limited uses. The main dungeon items are all arrow-based as well, making discovering them quite boring. This doesn't harm the gameplay at all though, as each item is used to its fullest, perhaps even more so than Ocarina of Time. And the masks are frequently used across the game's 5 dungeons and 4 mini-dungeons. That may sound a bit light on content compared to previous games in this series, but Majora's Mask makes up for it with its amazing and deep side quests. Several of which are a necessity to complete the game, but many of them are just for heart pieces, making some less rewarding than others. But the story of each is still charming and fun to do, bar a few which are hindered by the game's overarching mechanic. Before I talk about that though, I need to mention this game's fantastic story. Set shortly after Ocarina of Time's ending, where Link returns to his childhood and Navi flew away, we find Link wandering through a forest on horseback in search of her, when he is suddenly ambushed by the game's main antagonist, the Skull Kid, a returning character from Ocarina of Time, but now with the demonic mask of Majora upon his face. His mischievous pranks are turned into cataclysmic events as the demon Majora controls him and starts dragging a terrifying moon down into the game's new location, Termina. In 3 days, the moon will crash down, killing everyone and destroying the world. Link must traverse the land of Termina to gather the 4 giants in order to stop the moon and defeat Majora. 3 days is not enough though, so Link must use the Ocarina of Time and the Song of Time to revert 3 days back to the point he first entered Termina over and over again in order to complete the many quests laid out before him. This story mechanic is represented in-game by a 3-day cycle system where the characters and events all happen at specific times on specific days. If you mess up a task or miss your time window, you must revert time and wait for that specific moment again. This mechanic is unique and in a lot of ways very fun, creating one of the most alive worlds of any game I've played. The only issue it does create is a lot of the time you are simply stood there doing nothing, waiting for things to happen. This gets tedious and does drag out the length of the game artificially, as there's little you can do during this waiting period, other than a few basic mini-games dotted around the world. One of the most painstaking side quests, in my opinion, is also one of my favourites, the Couple's Mask. You have to wait for specific times of the day on all 3 days to complete it. Miss any of them and you will have to do all of them all over again. Also, there's another mask as part of this side quest, but you can only get it if you choose not to get another reward, meaning you have to repeat most of the steps in the quest in order to 100% the game. You can make time slow down or speed up with the Song of Time, but you can only move time forward by 6 in-game hours, meaning you can be stood around for quite some time. This was thankfully fixed in the 3DS version, but felt like an obvious design flaw in the original that could have been fixed. Despite these issues though, each of the side quests, even when you do have to wait a long time for specific moments, is worthwhile both in their rewards and the wonderful stories that go along with them. Some of them sad, some of them happy, but all of them are full of character and create some of the best side quests you can experience. Some highlights for me being the alien invasion of the ranch, the couple's mask quest, despite its long wait times, and the Goron racetrack. As the moon comes ever closer as well, the central town becomes less and less populated as people flee their impending doom, making the situation feel even more dire. I first played the game in 2006 when I came across the Zelda Collector's Edition for GameCube and took a crack at completing it. I originally tried it without a guide and managed to get about halfway through when I got frustrated with the game and gave up. In 2010, when I played through all the Zeldas for the release of Skyward Sword, I finally got around to completing it. In my first few playthroughs, I really didn't enjoy the game very much. I found the time mechanic incredibly stressful, and having to redo full cycles when I messed up became really tedious. With the 3DS release in 2015, I had a lot more fun, especially since finding all the side quests was a lot easier thanks to the improved Bomber's Notebook, a mechanic that stores information as you speak to characters to help you work out when side quests would start. With the 3DS version, I started to see why people loved this game so much, especially with the improved time skip mechanics. Although I used a guide to know what masks I needed to get and when, I mostly played the game without any help and really found it to be a compelling game. For the playthrough for this video, I played the original on the Nintendo Switch, and although the modern features of the 3DS were missed, it was still a great way to play, and the benefit of being able to create save states in case anything goes wrong was very useful. The atmosphere and the story really make this game a classic, and I enjoy it more every time I return. A particular highlight for me is the bizarre ending when you enter the moon and see the beautiful final dungeon landscape. It was the last thing I was expecting. If you collect every mask in the game, which I highly recommend you do, you can fight Majora's Mask pretty much with invincibility thanks to the Fierce Deity mask, turning Link into an adult again. On this playthrough, I decided not to use it, and well, I highly advise you do the same, as Majora's Mask is one of the most enjoyably challenging bosses in the whole franchise, and I wish I'd tried fighting him as regular Link sooner. The other boss fights vary in quality, the first dungeons being good, the second boss fight, where you chase a giant bull rolling as a Goron, being one of the best in the franchise, but it's all sadly let down by the third and fourth boss fights, with tedious fight against the fish as Azora, and a visually exciting fight in the fourth dungeon, but dull in terms of mechanics. Finally, there's the presentation. Graphically, it's a slight upgrade over Ocarina of Time, thanks to the additional RAM from the N64 expansion pack required to play the original game. It gives a bit more detail in the environments and character models. But the music is what really sets it apart. Koji Kondo shines once again as he creates a compelling and dark soundtrack. Majora's theme being especially daunting, and the Song of Healing being both peaceful and sad at the same time. It's one of my favourite songs in the whole franchise, and is used very meaningfully throughout the game's story. All the songs throughout the game are wonderfully composed, and although there is a few returning ones from Ocarina of Time, there is more than enough new material here. Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time are still two incredible classics. For me, they're not my favourites in the franchise, but the more I play them, the more enjoyment I get out of them, and the more they become some of my favourite games ever. I only wish they could have gotten a third game, as Majora's Mask feels very much like a middle part of a trilogy. Others seem to think this as well. One person, known as Major Link on YouTube, has created an incredible fan animation and story that follows on after the events of Majora's Mask and Link has become an adult. It's amazing work, with episode 5 being one of the best videos I've ever seen on YouTube. I have linked to their channel in the description below. I hope that one day we can also get a game that follows on from Majora's Mask, and we get to see what led to the Hero of Time's cruel fate we see in Twilight Princess. In the meantime though, we can still enjoy the incredible fan animation known as Hero's Purpose, and two of the best games ever made. Zelda's first step into 3D was a big moment in gaming history, but Nintendo thankfully didn't give up on the series' classic 2D roots either, as we soon got two new Zelda games on the same day for the Game Boy Color, and they were developed by an unlikely studio. In my next video I move on to the Game Boy Color generation with the Oracle of Ages and Seasons. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Phil, I'm the creator of the Pixel Tavern. I hope you enjoyed the video. These two games get spoken about a lot online, so I really appreciate it for checking out my thoughts on them as well. Looks like I'm not going to get through all of these games before Tears of the Kingdom, but I hope you stick around to join me on my quest through the whole series. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the Pixel Tavern, like the video, and leave a comment on your experience with these two iconic N64 classics. When did you first play them, and on what system? Would you love to see a sequel to them? And what's your thoughts on the terrifying face of the moon? As a quick plug for my other project as well, I also run a film podcast where each season has a different theme of films we cover. This season is particularly relevant as it covers the dreaded world of video game movies. Please check out That Dan Film Show. You can find a link to it on Spotify in the description below. Otherwise though, if you want to see more of my videos, you can find them on screen now. Until next time everyone, thank you very much for watching.